Welcome, everyone. On behalf of the High Committee on Human Fraternity, I would like to welcome you to the High Committee on Human Fraternity 2021 Women's Forum, held in celebration of the International Women's Day. I'm Irina Bokova. I'm the former Director General of UNESCO and member of the High Committee on Human Fraternity. The High Committee is an organization that was born out of the document on human fraternity, which was signed by Pope Francis and the Grand Imam of Egypt's Al-Azhar in 2019. The document urges reconciliation of all the world's citizens for the sake of universal peace, and is clear that upholding women's rights is essential to human fraternity. On this International Women's Day, we are spreading awareness about the rights of women. Women are facing an increasing socio-economic and safety challenges due to the coronavirus pandemic. From vulnerable refugees to working mothers, women are facing unprecedented obstacles that threaten to reverse years of progress towards women's rights. While the challenges women face in 2021 are many, the multitude of issues are outnumbered by the brilliant female minds dedicated to finding solutions to overcome them. Today, we will hear from a distinguished collection of female leaders, government officials, and activists about the current struggles of women around the globe and their suggestions for how to support women during and after the COVID-19 crisis at both local and international levels. Joining us today are Vice President of Costa Rica, Her Excellency Epsi Campbell Barr, United Arab Emirates Minister of Youth and Culture, Her Excellency Noura Al-Kabi, Executive Director of UNFPA, the United Nations Population Fund, Natalia Kanem, Ambassador Susan Esserman, activist and Zayed Award recipient Latifa Bin Ziaten, Secretary General of Religions for Peace, Aza Karam. Also joining us today from the High Committee on Human Fraternity is my colleague and dear friend, Judge Mohammed Abdul Salam, the Secretary General of the High Committee on Human Fraternity, who will share with us his message in celebration of International Women's Day at the closing of this forum. I would like to thank you all for accepting to participate in this very special event. Now, before we get started with our, I hope, lively discussions, we have a pre-recorded message from Phumzile Mlambo-Tsuka, who is the Executive Director of United Nations Women and United Nations Under-Secretary General, and a long-time champion of women's rights. She has held several positions in South African government, including the role of Vice President, and was actively involved in the struggle to end apartheid in her home country. And I would add, a dear friend, personal of mine.
Taken on the response to the pandemic. We need you to help us to call for women's representation everywhere. We know that where there are special measures, policies, quotas, targets to facilitate women's participation, it does increase and it is sustained. But where you lend your voices as well, that too cements women's participation. So we would look forward to collaborate with you. We look forward to hear your voice at the Commission on the Status of Women, which will be taking place in March at the United Nations, where you can extend your views on women's leadership following this International Women's Day. Women have also been affected by violence. Women who are leaders, especially members of parliament, have complained about being targeted for violence, sexual violence, physical violence, cyberbullying, and that has deterred them and discouraged them from taking part in leadership. We need you to call for all hands on deck when it comes to the fighting of this shadow pandemic that gender violence is. We are calling on, again, the police, the social workers, the families, because at home is where most of the violence happens. And we are calling on you to support families, to talk about it in the places of worship and call on the end of violence against women. This is a call we expect to hear during this International Women's Day and for it to be repeated whenever we are congregating. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bokova and UN Undersecretary General Malamba Nukuga. And good morning, afternoon, and evening to all those joining us from around the world. As mentioned, my name is Emily Judd, and I will be moderating the first ever Women's Forum for the Higher Committee of Human Fraternity. I am thrilled to be moderating this forum of accomplished women leaders and activists that have dedicated their lives to creating a better world for all. Our speakers are from various backgrounds, fields, and religions. And our hope for this forum is that it will inspire a global conversation on both the challenges that women are facing today and the strategies on how to overcome those challenges. You can, if you're watching, follow and add to our conversation on social media using the hashtag HCHF Women Forum. We have heard from Ms. Bokova and UN Women Executive Director Malamba Nukuga about the challenging and vulnerable situation that women around the world find themselves in 2021. I would like to now start our live discussion with Vice President of Costa Rica, Her Excellency Epsi Campbell-Barr. In her role, Vice President Campbell-Barr directs the National Plan for Women's Economic Empowerment and Leadership, which aims to reduce gender gaps and create better opportunities for women. Vice President Campbell-Barr previously served for 2 terms in Congress and as Minister of Foreign Relations. Your Excellency, you are Vice President of Costa Rica, and you also have a background in economics. Before COVID, the World Economic Forum, in their 2019 Global and Gender Gap Report, estimated that the gender gap in economic participation and opportunity would not close for another 257 years. Now, in a post-COVID era, women, according to the UN, are facing long-term setbacks in workforce participation and income. Your Excellency, how many years of progress do you estimate that the pandemic has set women back economically? And what are some proven economic policies that governments can adopt to assist women during this time?
Thank you very much. Distinguished guests and participants, it is an honor for me to participate in this extraordinary event. I congratulate the Higher Committee of Human Fraternity for organizing this activity. The COVID-19 pandemic threatens to set back development to the first time in the last 30 years. That is why today, more than ever, we need to join forces to mitigate the impacts of this unprecedented global crisis. The new normal has to be built on the foundation of justice, inclusion, equity, and solidarity. As you know, humanity faces 4 interrelated crises: health, climate, biodiversity, and socioeconomic. This reality is a call for reflection on the current economic development model, its impact of nature and social gap caused by it. This is a time to make decisions and generate different solutions, promote collaboration leadership, and put nature at the forefront of the development agenda and the human rights. This is a time to work with women with a specific policies in all the areas of the development. The social inequality that the world was experiencing before 2020 has increased dramatically in recent months and is mainly affected by women, populations that have historically been vulnerable, and such as indigenous people, rural people, Afro-descendants community, who have been affected by this difficult situation, forced to travel a path full of new vulnerabilities. In case of women, the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, projects that 47 million women and girls will fall below the poverty line, and a fortunate figure that is add to another 435 million women who are in such a condition. Add to this complex reality in the increase of gender-based violence and intensified burden of unpaid care. For the importance of women, it is essential that we make money available to women in general and women of rural areas, African descent, indigenous women in particular, so they can develop their businesses and community, national and international level. Put money in the pocket of the women is one of the first measures that we have to do. That is why I want to join me in the promoting the International Bank for Women and for vulnerable peoples, to provide a concrete opportunity to women and community to close the gaps. We need more women entrepreneurs. Finally, I would like to point that Costa Rica actively joins in highlighting the importance of universal health insurance as a requirement for the right to mental health, mainly during the COVID-19 pandemic. Mental health is a necessary condition for well-being and physical health, and also for the economic development of women. Therefore, we urgently need to work together with international institutions, the private sector, non-governmental and community organizations. Mental health also service must have a human rights approach, recognizing the diverse identity of all the people, warranting quality and non-discrimination. Costa Rica has taken important steps toward universal access and coverage of the mental health care service, but COVID-19 has made it clear that we must make greater efforts on this regard, particularly in those women of whom the cost of the pandemic has fallen disproportionately. In that sense, my country is working in regional alliance for women mental health and global compact for care. That today is the day to celebrate strength, resilience, and the ability of women to build a new world and invite men to make an alliance for justice and equality. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency Vice President Campbell-Barr, for your thoughtful answer on a very complex question. I want to now bring in Her Excellency Noura Al-Kabi, who is Minister of Culture and Youth for the United Arab Emirates. Minister Al-Kabi is the chairperson of the National Committee for Education, Culture, and Science in the UAE, and is also president of Zayed University. We've been discussing the pandemic's economic impact on women, and it's also important to address its impact on working mothers. Recent surveys have found that a larger percentage of working mothers compared to working fathers are suffering from workplace burnout and increased anxiety. Your Excellency, Minister Al-Kabi, how can governments support working mothers during this time? What practices have been implemented in the UAE to help working women during this pandemic?
Thank you, Emily. And I would like to thank the Human Fraternity Committee for such an event. It's an honor to be with such wonderful, inspiring women this evening. And let me begin with thanking my dear brother and friend, Judge Abdussalam, for such an event that I hope soon we will all be meeting under one roof and discussing opportunities and what we foresee for the future, for not just women, but for mankind. As well, congratulations on a successful papal visit to Iraq, a safe one. I think Pope Francis did spread hope, not just in Iraq, but in the region with such visit. And I think we in such time, everyone from whatever background or religion we believe in, this is such a step that brings up hope and restores it, not just physically, but the soul as well. Going back to your question, the founder of this nation had a wish. He wished for a woman in the UAE to be one day a diplomat or an engineer or a doctor. I'll give you just quick percentages. 50% of women are in the parliament. We have 66% working in the government sector. We have 75% working in the healthcare sector. 50% worked in the mission of hope, the Mars mission. And leading that Mars mission was a great scientist and a woman. We have 9 ministers, and of course, we have a lot of wonderful graduates in technology and STEM and science. More than 70% are women in the UAE. And talking about such time and how the pandemic is affecting us, especially working mothers, with the online learning. Whenever the school goes online, it's by default. My colleagues who are mothers are not in the office because we do believe that remote working is doable, and we believe the importance of striking the balance and investing in the future generation. It's clear there are many disruptions, job losses, economic slowdown across the world, while the impact on some sectors may be far larger than others. It is correct also to conclude that the impact of the pandemic has been unprecedented. I can answer your question only anecdotally because we are yet to see the end of this pandemic. And we do not have any comprehensive and precise data on the impact of COVID yet on women workforce. The UAE has a strong legal framework to ensure that women are not disadvantaged in any way in the job market. In 2018, the UAE cabinet approved a law on equal wages and salaries for women and men. This covers both private and public sector. After the 2019 elections, women, as I mentioned, comprised half of the Federal National Council members. In the IMF World Competitiveness Yearbook 2020, the UAE ranked the first in the Female Parliamentary Representation Index. Nearly a third of UAE diplomats are female. I am mentioning these facts so you know that this is a country that we're going to celebrate our 50th by the end of this year. And I think, for us, it's so crucial and important to double down in our efforts in with such community or such individuals who are just part of society, and who are just going to be incomplete without, or with less providing of the right policies and opportunities to them. As measures implemented during the pandemic, I think the most important decision concerning women in the job market, as I mentioned, was allowed mothers with children in grade 6 and below, or those with children of determination, to work remotely from home. Also, the decision included the husbands of working women in the medical and educational sector. It's a joint effort. It's crucial for us to strike that balance when it comes to males and females and couples who are looking after such kids. This is my answer in short. Once again, it's an honor and a pleasure, and wonderful to be here with you again. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency, for sharing your insight with us on this important issue, and also sharing about, real practices that have been implemented in the UAE. Now we're going to be talking from the importance of women's participation in the workforce to another essential topic, which is refugees. During her time serving as the first female Director General of UNESCO, Irina Bokova used her platform to advocate for refugees, specifically their right to education. Ms. Bokova, the pandemic has worsened the situation of refugees and displaced persons, the majority of which are women and children. Safety, hygiene, and preventative measures are harder to maintain in refugee camps or temporary housing. How can the international community support this population who are at risk in so many ways?
Thank you very much for this question. I'm really very happy to be here at this conference, and particularly to congratulate once again my dear friend Noor Al-Kabi, the minister, because what she just said, it's a wonderful example that gender equality indeed can be achieved when there is a political will and a very strong focus. And of course, I would like to congratulate the Vice President of Costa Rica, because she raised a very important issue, the issue of poverty and the issue of the impact of crisis. And we know that the impact of crisis are never gender neutral, and COVID-19 is no exception. And particularly when we speak about the refugees and displaced persons, it's a crisis within a crisis. And this is where I believe we should put a lot more focus and emphasis. And here I speak both as a former Director General of UNESCO, but also as a member of the High Committee on Human Fraternity, where we have taken a very strong position in terms of supporting and looking at how to tackle this huge humanitarian crisis that is into the making. And we know that in many camps, in many displaced persons, it is mostly women and girls which are at risk because of gender-based violence, because of lack of hygienic facilities and services. And also you mentioned the education, where in very many of the circumstances, the access to education was prevented because of lack of online learning, because of lack to the digital access. And this is something that has to be taken very seriously, because if we do not do it, we will have again a lost generation into the making. And I would like to say that if, and I know that the United Nations, all the humanitarian community is taking this very seriously. Of course, I'm speaking about health, water, sanitation, hygiene, education in this particular case. And I'm sure that another friend of mine, Natalia Kanem, will mention and will speak about that once again. There are many data that are coming nowadays, that are published nowadays. There is a special tool which was launched by the United Nations Women and UNDP on the tracking of the COVID-19 pandemic or its impact on girls and women, including also in making a particular emphasis on refugees and displaced people. On one side, of course, there is a need for a lot more funding to it. There is a lot of, I would say, need for political action within the Global Refugee Forum. There are many commitments, but I think we have to put promises also and concrete actions where promises lay in order to give the opportunity and also the possibility of many children, refugee children and displaced persons also to have this access. Just one figure, which is, I believe, staggering, because you started asking me about education. Over 8 million refugee children are no longer able to go to school, and maybe in the foreseeable future, they will not go to school. And part of this, I would say, also fall down is a dramatic increase into the forced early and child marriages. So we have to take all this into account when we speak about our response to the COVID-19 crisis.
Thank you so much, Ms. Bokova. Before going on to our next topic, which is going to be ending violence and discrimination against women, I want to thank Her Excellency Vice President Epsi Campbell-Barr and Her Excellency Minister Noor Al-Kabi for joining us today amid all of your other commitments. We appreciate both of you for making the time to participate in the HCHF Women's Forum. I would like to give the floor to Judge Mohammed Abdel Salam for a moment.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليكم جميعا. الحقيقة ليس الآن موعد كلمتي ولا يمكن أن أتدخل بين هذه الكوكبة العظيمة، ولكن قبل نهاية الجلسة الأولى أود أن أشكر السيدة فومزيل، وأيضا أشكر السيدة إبسي نائب على كلمتها التي أثارت موضوعات هي مهمة للغاية، وأعد أني سأتواصل معك قريبا لنناقش هذه بشكل فعال. كما أنني أيضا أود أن أشكر الصديقة العزيزة الوزيرة المتميزة السيدة نور الكعب، وتعليقها على زيارة البابا فعلا هو محور جديد وحلقة كثيرة من حلقات الأخوة الإنسانية، وأيضا هي تقوم بجهد كبير في تحقيق وتعزيز الأخوة، فهي تسهم مع اليونسكو في مشروع إنساني عظيم في إعادة إعمار الموصل، وهي أكثر المدن التي تأثرت من التطرف بالتهديد والتدمير في العراق. لوجودك معنا، وصديقتي العزيزة إيرينا، كلامك دائما ملهم وإشارتك تذكرينا، وشكرا لوجودكم معنا اليوم، واسمحوا لي أن أقلد الجلسة الثانية. شكرا.
Your Excellencies, thank you so much for joining us. We are now honored to have UN expert Natalia Khanum with us for a discussion about eliminating violence and discrimination against women. Ms. Khanum is the Executive Director of UNFPA, the United Nations Sexual and Reproductive Health and Rights Agency. She has over 30 years of strategic leadership experience in the fields of preventative medicine, public and reproductive health, social justice, and philanthropy. Ms. Khanum, your UN colleague, Ms. Phumzile Mlambo Nguka, said earlier that gender-based violence is a shadow pandemic. Domestic violence against women has reportedly surged since the start of COVID-19. The Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, has said that the increase in domestic violence against women is a pandemic within a pandemic. How is the UN working with governments to help save women from violence during this time?
Well, thank you so much, Emily. Your Excellencies, the Vice President, Irina Bokova, Judge Abdel Salam, dear Azza, sisters, everyone, happy Women's Day. And thank you for joining us. When it comes to the issue of domestic violence, violence against women, sexual and gender-based violence, the fact is that people of faith are called to uphold the values that this human fraternity higher committee represents. And the UNFPA is very honored to be with you today. My concern is to make clear that indeed, as our Secretary General, as Madame Plumzile and Madame Irina have highlighted, there is a pandemic within a pandemic, which actually began ages and millennia ago. The respect and value of women must start with the girl child, who must be encouraged to understand that she is the equal of everyone on the planet and that her aspirations are important. This pandemic has brought forth a gender-based violence statistical explosion, but long before the pandemic, the truth is that on average, 1 in 3 females experienced some form of gender-based violence or harassment during her lifetime. So indeed, it's long past due, as the Secretary General has said, in his call to action, which I'm pleased to report that at this point, 146 member states have responded to. The Secretary General, in calling for peace in the home, is echoing his call for the silencing of the guns and highlighting that even in humanitarian settings, the dignity and respect of female human beings is a precious thing. The United Nations across the whole is working closely with governments at all levels to support programmatic responses, especially on the ground at the country level where the United Nations proves itself. The increasing rates of domestic violence have been a challenge, calling on all of us to adapt very quickly, together with partners in civil society, I will stress, to deliver remote services. You can imagine if someone is in lockdown, locked in with an abusive partner, the ability to contact someone, to have someone visit, to have a hotline available can be life-saving. We're also paying attention to the prevention of violence. And in this sense, again, I think the community of faith has the responsibility to destigmatize women and girls who come forward to complain, to say that they are uneasy or something is wrong. They deserve to be listened to very carefully. On a global level, we're also attempting to disaggregate the statistics so that we can make concrete steps to understanding, are we making a difference? So having disaggregated data is very important to support governments to target who may be in need and to follow her through with counseling, with shelter for herself and her family as required, and also to provide guidance to medical personnel, to schools. And as has already been noted, girls now out of school are much more available for child marriage, for the promulgation of female genital mutilation and other things that can be done to them against their will. Again, very, very important for communities, traditional leaders, faith leaders, organizations of civil society and the United Nations to contribute to dialogues such as the fraternity is having today. So we're very, very grateful to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Khanna. The document on human fraternity, which has been the inspiration for the Higher Committee on Human Fraternity, the foundation of the Higher Committee, states that it's necessary to protect women from sexual exploitation and from being treated as merchandise or objects of pleasure or financial gain. It urges an end must be brought to all inhumane and vulgar practices that denigrate the dignity of women. I want to bring in Ambassador Susan Esserman, founder and director of the University of Maryland Safe Center for Human Trafficking Survivors. Ambassador Esserman has previously served in 4 senior positions in the Clinton administration, and she's going to be sharing a little bit about her insight today. Ambassador, although pandemic preventative measures like lockdowns may seem to dissuade human trafficking, the UN is warning that criminal traffickers are adjusting their work to the new circumstances, in particular by using modern communication technologies. As the COVID-19 recession puts more individuals at risk, how do we stop criminal traffickers from exploiting this situation?
I want to thank the Higher Committee of Human Fraternity for holding this important discussion, and I'm honored to join this distinguished group of women today. Sex and labor trafficking thrive on human misery and vulnerability. Isolation is a tactic used by traffickers to control their victims. While lockdowns are vitally necessary for public health, traffickers have taken advantage of the increased isolation, driving trafficking further underground and putting victims at even greater risk. During economic crises, traffickers prey on and seek to exploit those most desperate for income, shelter, food, housing, and security. And during this pandemic, as you've heard, critical government services that would ordinarily support victims have been severely limited. At the same time, there is a surge in demand for those services. With school closures, children and adolescents have been spending more time on the internet and have become more vulnerable to trafficking, as reflected in reports of dramatic increases on online exploitation during the pandemic. And women who have suffered gross inequities for generations are among the most affected by the pandemic and also are the most vulnerable to sex and labor trafficking. Indeed, a pandemic within a pandemic. To date, efforts to address human trafficking have often focused on providing services to survivors after the fact. As we look toward a post-COVID era, it is essential to focus on the root causes of gender-based violence and human trafficking, sexism, structural racism, poverty, the migration crisis, and nativism and intolerance. Most immediately, we must strengthen the social safety net. Cash assistance and other recovery programs should be designed to take into account the needs of women and others most affected by the pandemic, including non-citizens typically left out of relief and most vulnerable to traffickers. Accessible and affordable public services such as healthcare, child and elder care are particularly essential for women. Homelessness and housing insecurity are drivers as well as a consequence of trafficking. Therefore, it is critical to continue rent and eviction relief and make important investments in affordable housing. We should enhance law enforcement to deter and prevent trafficking, especially in light of what we've seen during the pandemic. To that point, there should be greater government partnership with internet and credit card companies and banks to prevent online sexual exploitation, to disrupt payment methods, and reduce supply and demand. It is often not appreciated that labor trafficking, which is also inherently violent, is far more prevalent globally than sex trafficking. Thus, there should be an increased focus on labor trafficking prosecutions. Labor protections should be extended to all sectors, including informal workers and domestic and agricultural workers, and the essential workers who have carried such a heavy burden during the pandemic. We should increase oversight of guest worker programs and international labor recruiters, both of which are drivers of labor trafficking. Finally, we urge an all-of-government approach to combat trafficking in which governments deploy economic, foreign policy, public health, as well as law enforcement tools. And since trafficking is a transnational crime, greater government-to-government collaboration is essential.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Esserman, for sharing your insight on what is a very, very depressing topic and state of affairs. Much of our conversation thus far has touched on how governments and institutions can help women through challenges made worse by the pandemic. But there's also much that can be done at the local and grassroots level. We have two women with us tonight that are involved in activism, specifically relating to religion. Latifa Ibn Ziyatin is an activist against religious extremism who started speaking out following the death of her son in a terrorist attack in 2012. She is president of the Ahmad Ibn Ziyatin Association for Youth and recently received the 2021 Zayed Award for Human Fraternity. Latifa, the coronavirus pandemic has consumed the attention of the world, taking focus away from other important issues, such as the work that you're doing, promoting tolerance, peace, and dialogue among youth. How is your organization continuing your work with young women and young people? What roles can women play in preventing and countering violent extremism?
Bonjour à toutes et à tous, et je suis ravie de participer à ce forum comité. Vraiment, je suis très touchée par Georges Abdessalam et Madame Skova et toutes ces femmes qui sont présentes. J'ai travaillé, ça fait à peu près 9 ans, à travers la jeunesse, à travers l'éducation des parents et avec les jeunes qui partent malheureusement en Syrie, qui tombent dans cette secte terroriste. Comment j'ai travaillé malgré cette pandémie, c'est par WhatsApp, Skype, Zoom. J'ai pas arrêté parce que c'était important de continuer le dialogue avec les familles, avec cette jeunesse. C'était très important. Malgré ce Covid, l'électrologie d'aujourd'hui nous facilité le travail par Skype. J'ai beaucoup travaillé par Skype. Comment je dois continuer aujourd'hui? Je vois avec la pandémie, ça crée beaucoup de violence. Ce moment-là, en France, les jeunes, ils ne peuvent plus supporter d'être enfermés. Ça fait des dégâts. Il faut vraiment continuer le travail aujourd'hui avec eux et je dois avancer. Vraiment, c'est nécessaire. J'ai dédié ma vie, mon temps, j'ai sacrifié ma famille pour aller vers ces jeunes parce que je ne veux pas voir un autre mère. De perdre un fils de 30 ans, ce n'est pas facile, mais la vie doit continuer et je dois aider l'autre jeune. C'est très important parce que cette jeunesse aujourd'hui, c'est l'avenir. Et mon travail aujourd'hui, je pense que j'ai voyagé dans le monde et j'ai vu, c'est vrai, les femmes, elles souffrent encore. Il y a beaucoup de souffrance dans les campagnes, même dans les écoles, parce qu'il y a certaines jeunes filles qui quittent l'école parce que question d'organisation, etc., elle n'est pas conforme. Comment le rôle d'une femme? La femme, d'abord, c'est une mère, c'est une épouse, c'est une sœur. Une femme, elle est forte. Une femme, elle peut donner beaucoup d'amour. Comment je peux vous expliquer? Déjà, moi, ma jeunesse, je sais comment j'ai souffert dans ma jeunesse et j'ai pris ma liberté à l'âge de 9 ans grâce à cette éducation qui m'a donnée ma grand-mère. et qu'aujourd'hui, je transmets aux autres parce que la femme, elle est forte, il fait beaucoup de choses qu'on ne croit pas. La femme aujourd'hui, elle a sa place mondiale. Mais il faut de l'aide. Il faut de l'aide pour certaines femmes qui sont enfermées chez eux. Certaines femmes qui ont oublié de donner l'éducation à leurs enfants. Et c'est mon rôle aujourd'hui d'aller vers ces femmes et ces jeunes. C'est ce que je fais tous les jours sur le terrain, que ce soit dans les foyers, que ce soit dans les écoles, que ce soit dans les maisons d'arrêt, que ce soit dans les foyers fermés. Et j'ai besoin d'aller encore plus loin. J'ai envie de créer un centre vraiment pour accueillir les jeunes et les jeunes filles et même des femmes en difficulté pour que je puisse les accompagner et les aider. Voilà ce que je fais aujourd'hui dans mon association Humane pour la jeunesse et la paix, et grâce à tout le monde qui me soutient et qui m'aide. Et ce prix Zaïd, il va m'ouvrir beaucoup de portes, que je remercie Georges Abdsalam de me faciliter aussi la vie et de continuer mon combat que je tiens vraiment énormément aujourd'hui.
Thank you so much, Latifa, both for your words and your work. I would like to go now to Secretary General of Religions for Peace, Azza Karam, Professor Azza Karam. Before leading Religions for Peace, which is the largest multi-religious leadership platform in the world, Professor Karam was a senior advisor on culture at the United Nations Population Fund. Professor Karam, the COVID-19 pandemic has affected all people, regardless of background, nationality, religion. Believers of different faiths are now helping their neighbors of other religions face COVID-19 related challenges and are uniting in prayer. For instance, the Higher Committee of Human Fraternity last year organized a worldwide day of prayer to ask for all of humanity to ask God to help us overcome the coronavirus pandemic. Professor Karam, I'm wondering, how have interreligious relations and human fraternity strengthened during the pandemic? What have been some moments of hope that you've seen for human fraternity amid the pandemic, and how can we move that forward and make sure that that continues?
Thank you very much, Ms. Judd, and well done on a beautiful job of moderating all these distinguished, amazing giants of women on this call. Tremendous gratitude to His Excellency Judge Mohammed Abdulsalam and the Higher Committee for Human Fraternity for organizing this session in the first place. It is a tremendous initiative which deserves full commendation and appreciation, and I am certainly deeply honored to be with you, and thank you for the question. A quick point of note that the quote that we saw earlier from the Higher Committee on Human Fraternity, which is included in the document of Human Fraternity, in itself seminal in the fact that the Catholic Pope and the Muslim Imam, the Grand Imam, together put these words and these commitments in the document on human fraternity. It is historic in every possible sense, social, political, cultural. And as such, there is a great deal, I think, of gratitude amongst those of us who are activists, which by the way is all of us, in the human rights space. It is a tremendously powerful document. Why? Not because the words in it are new in any way, shape, or form, but because it is a commitment from two leading men of two of the largest religious establishments of the world, Al-Azhar and the Vatican. And the fact that they, some 75 years after the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, can actually reiterate these points in a document in which they commit to the fraternity of humanity, that in and of itself is a remarkably valuable point. It happened to come just before we had the corona COVID pandemic. All the more reason, God works in mysterious ways, as they say. We have an opportunity to celebrate, not just to call upon because it's already there, but to celebrate the fact that the world's two largest religious institutions, which between them have billions of believers, have actually been able to reiterate finally what we see in the international and universal and indivisible human rights declaration. So tremendous, I think, appreciation for that. And we should never take that for granted. This is not simply yet another thing that a few religious guys do. This is major, it is significant. It is equally major and significant when 250 religious leaders representing all faiths from the Vatican, but across the faith spectrum, including indigenous people, can come together for the first time in history in December of 2019 and actually plan together what they will hold themselves accountable to for the next 5 years. That was a strategic planning meeting that Religions for Peace hosted in December of 2019. For the first time ever, 250 faith leaders representing every single faith tradition known to humankind came together and planned and committed and held each other accountable to 6 priorities, all corresponding with the Sustainable Development Goals agenda. Priority number 1 was gender equality and women's empowerment. For the first time in the 50-year history of interreligious collaboration and interreligious gathering, these leaders committed themselves to this. That too should never be taken for granted. Part of a challenge that we have been seeing confronting right now as a result of the COVID crisis, and we were speaking about it before COVID hit us, was the shrinking civil society space. Well, if it was shrinking before COVID, the authoritarianism in the name of protection of its human beings, that COVID has resulted in several regimes around the region and all over the world actually now maintaining that in order to protect, they had to become more authoritarian. That means that the shrinking civil society space of before has become even more of a shrinking dynamic in the COVID crisis. What we see in the context that has been very ably responded to by so many of the luminaries that have spoken ahead of me, who are all my teachers and professors, what we see is the epidemic of gender-based violence, which has taken massive proportions because we are talking about a shrinking civil society space. Because really, at the end of the day, those who help those gender-based violence survivors, those who help them, are the civic institutions, even before the governmental ones step in, as we can see from the leadership of Her Excellency Ms. Latifa, which was very generously recognized and kindly, considerately recognized by the Higher Committee on Human Fraternity. Civil society institutions are our future. They are where our youth are mostly in bulk engaging. We have the largest youth number in the world today, as I have learned from the United Nations Population Fund esteemed colleagues. We have a youth bulge of unprecedented proportions today. This youth bulge is not reflected in our governmental institutions. It is, however, reflected in our civic space. And one of the key challenges of our civic space, not so much from the government, but has been from the fact that the secular and the religious civil spaces often operate in distinction from one another. There are very rare moments when we see a civil society that convenes the religious and the secular. And what COVID has helped us do is it's forced us to look beyond the parameters and the boundaries of our traditional partnerships. We were already speaking about that in the United Nations system. We were talking about non-traditional partners. Today, we have to manifest the solidarity and to support the solidarity of these non-traditional partnerships between the religious and the secular civic spaces. Religions for Peace created a multi-religious humanitarian fund. And yes, I know I'm supposed to speak about the bright lights and the hopeful moments. Creating the first ever multi-religious humanitarian fund to insist on doing something which is a trend, unfortunately, coming out of COVID. What is that trend? The trend is that the secular space is working on its own, the religious space is working on its own, continues to, because they're first line responders in humanitarian crises anyway, but we notice that the Catholic works separately, the Protestants work separately, the Muslim Sunnah work separately, the Muslim Shia work separately. That is a disease. And it will hurt, first and foremost, the women of all these communities. We cannot afford to let the religions respond to the humanitarian emergency separately. We must encourage and support them to work together with one another and to work with the secular institutions. That is why Religions for Peace created the multi-religious humanitarian funds. To date, it's 1 year since the creation of this fund. To date, one religious community, the Risho Kosekai Japanese Buddhists, are the only ones who have contributed to this fund. Everyone else, secular and of the different religions, keep saying, Well, we've already got our own mechanisms. I know we've already got our own mechanisms. That's the whole point. We've already got humanitarian mechanisms since time immemorial. Why are we not deliberately working together? Why are we not deliberately taking $1, putting it together with another dollar from another religious community, and indeed considering and deliberately ensuring that the religions work together? I'm not sure how many of you are aware, but at the height of New York City being the epidemic of the virus last year, one particular faith-based organization came and set up a massive intensive care unit in Central Park in New York. Now, if any of you know New York, you know that Central Park is a key issue, key monument of New York City. New York City, Central Park, you can't distinguish them. It set up an intensive care unit in Central Park. When 2 other religious organizations approached it and said, we'd like to help you, we'd like to support this, they were told, no, thank you, we've got this. But nobody's got this. And no one religious institution and no one political institution has got this. And the fact that we can even say that to one another when there is an offer of assistance shows that we're going down a very dangerous path indeed. So I would say the signs of hope is A, an appreciation that civil society needs to work together. B, a realization that humanitarian intervention is our future and we better work on that. And that if we genuinely want to support the youth, let's support them where they are. 80% of the world's youth today claim a religious affiliation. So for us to work on a secular space and ignore that means that we're frankly not really paying attention to what the youth themselves consider to be a key sense of their identity. But to work only as a Catholic or a Sunni Muslim or a Jew or whatever, that, I'm sorry, that wouldn't work. We have to, like this panel beautifully demonstrates, we have to come together in service. One of the lessons learned from the women's efforts globally is that women come together in service first and foremost. Yes, lots of sacrifices, as our dear Ms. Latifa has mentioned, but there's also a tremendous joy and a tremendous sense of empowerment of being able to serve alongside one another. And that is the original meaning of taking responsibility for solidarity. It is high time that we work to bridge the divide between secular and religious and to ensure that the religions work systematically together. Help us, as we do with our Higher Committee on Human Fraternity, work with Religions for Peace, the United Nations of Religions. It has every single religious institution and faith community represented. Help us work together. Help us make sure that the religious women of this world, who are 80% of the service deliverers across the world in humanitarian emergencies and otherwise, help us make sure that they are well served by all of us together. Let's show that solidarity in action, not just in words. Thank you to all the mentors that I have and will continue to have on this call. And many, many thanks to the Higher Committee on Human Fraternity and to you, Emily, for this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Karam, for your passionate words. And I think that they inspire us all. And thank you to all of our speakers, actually, for sharing insights on a variety of important topics related to obstacles facing women in a post-COVID era. For our closing, we are joined by Secretary General of the Higher Committee of Human Fraternity, Judge Mohammed Abdel Salam. He will be speaking in Arabic, and we have translation in English and French available in the below toolbar.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السيدات الحضور، الصديقات والأخوات الأعزاء، تحية خالصة لكم. شرف كبير أن أتواجد معكم اليوم، ونحن نتحدث في واحد من أهم الموضوعات التي ينبغي أن تأخذ نصيباً كبيراً من انشغالاتنا على كل المستويات. صحيح لا يمكن لأحد إنكار التقدم الذي أحرز في مجال الدفاع عن حقوق المرأة ونجاح بعض التجارب المجتمعية في تمكينها، إلا أن هذه النجاحات لا تمثل القاعدة العامة لوضع المرأة في كثير من مناطق عالمنا. الحقيقة أن المرأة في معظم المجتمعات تواجه تحديات كبيرة للغاية، ففي بعض المناطق تدفع ضريبة المتاجرة بها باسم عادات وتقاليد يروج لها البعض على أنها تعاليم دينية، ولكن الأديان منها بريئة. وفي مناطق أخرى تدفع المرأة ضريبة الفلسفات المادية التي تنظر إليها على أنها سلعة قابلة للترويج. وفي ظل هذه الأوضاع التي أقل ما يمكن وصفها بأنها مأساوية، نجد أكبر رمزين دينيين في العالم، الإمام الأكبر أحمد الطيب والبابا فرانسيس بابا الكنيسة الكاثوليكية، يتبنيان موقفاً واضحاً من الدفاع عن حقوق المرأة، تجلى في صياغتهما لوثيقة الأخوة الإنسانية، تلك الوثيقة التي أكدت أن الاعتراف بحقوق المرأة هو ضرورة إنسانية ملحة، ودعت إلى تحريرها من الضغوط التاريخية والاجتماعية المنافية لثوابت عقيدتها وكرامتها. الصديقات الأعزاء، الحقيقة أنكم ألهمتموني جميعا بكلماتكم، وسوزان كلماتك رائعة وملهمة، وأعدك أنني سأفكر كثيرا وسأستمع إلى هذه الكلمات التي قيلت اليوم عدة مرات وليس مرة واحدة، لنخرج بأفكار ومشروعات تنفذ على أرض الواقع. لطيفة، أمي لطيفة، أنت دائما ملهمة، وأنت نموذج مشجع في حد ذاته. صدقيني، يعني كلما رأيت صورتك على وسائل التواصل الاجتماعي أشعر بالفخر أن لدينا أم مثلك استطاعت أن تحول آلام الأمومة إلى آمال للشباب وحماية الشباب. فكما عودتيني كأم، سأظل منتظر لإلهاماتك وإرشاداتك حتى نمضي في الطريق الصحيح نحو الأخوة الإنسانية. أشكر أيضا السيدة الكريمة السيدة كانين، كلامك مهم، والحديث الذي ذكرتيه عن جهود الأمم المتحدة هو حديث مهم، ونحن لدينا شراكة كبيرة مع الأمم المتحدة وسنعززها بالعمل على ملف المرأة. عزة كرم صديقتي العزيزة وأختي الفاضلة الجريئة، أشكرك وأرجوك استمري في الدفاع عن هذه القضايا التي تهمنا بهذه الجرأة وهذا الحماس. فنحن نحتاج إلى الأصوات القوية، الأصوات الجريئة، الأصوات التي ليس لديها حسابات سوى الوصول إلى الحق والحقيقة. شكرا لكم جميعا. أعدكم أني سأحرص في الأيام القليلة القادمة على التواصل معكم والتناقش معكم والتباحث معكم حول مشروعات حقيقية على الأرض. نحن بدون المرأة لا يمكن أن نحقق أخوة إنسانية حقيقية. هذه قناعة أشهد الله وأشهدكم عليها. هذه القناعة التي وجدتها عند الإمام الأكبر، ووجدتها عند البوب فرانسيس، ووجدتها عند كثير من قادة الأديان حول العالم. هذه القناعة التي تعبر عن زملائي في اللجنة العليا للأخوة الإنسانية، الجميع يعيشها، ولكننا بشر. في النهاية نحتاج إلى دليل للتأثير، دليل لتفعيل مشروعات حقيقية على أرض الواقع. وأنا مؤمن تماما أن خير دليل لنا وخير ملهم لنا وخير موجه لنا هو المرأة، وخاصة حين تكون المرأة مجموعة من الخبراء النخبويين الذين يقدمون مشاريع حقيقية للإنسانية مثلكم. أشكركم شكرا جزيلا على مشاركتكم لنا اليوم، وهذه بداية. أعدكم أن هذه بداية، وبداية إن شاء الله بداية صحيحة، وسنستمر في العمل معكم والاستماع إلى توجيهاتكم وإرشاداتكم، وللنهوض بالمرأة بشكل حقيقي وشكل فعلي، وليس مجرد كلام أو شعارات. فأعتقد أن وقت الشعارات والكلام يجب أن يولي، يجب أن يذهب. والعنف ضد المرأة هو شيء مؤلم لكل إنسان لديه قلب، وأعتقد أنه يكفي ما حدث للمرأة في ظل العقود السابقة في مجتمعاتنا سواء الشرقية أو حتى في المجتمعات الغربية والعالمية. المرأة تحتاج إلى فعل الآن أكثر ما تحتاج إلى حديث جميل ومجاملات شكلية. شكرا لكم جزيلا على مشاركتكم لنا اليوم، وألهمتمونا وأسعدتمونا، وسأبقى دائما في خدمتكم وفي معاونتكم إن شاء الله. شكرا جزيلا.